They shut the gate in her face. Not a rusted gate, not one hanging loose on old church hinges, but a modern iron gate with fresh black paint and silent cruelty. It didn't creak, it clicked shut like a verdict. Sergeant Laverne Cole, standing, in full-dress uniform with her ribbons neatly aligned, watched the smooth metal bar slide into place just inches from her face. A young man in a black suit, no older than 25, held the key in one hand and a clipboard in the other. His brows furrowed, pretending not to recognize the medals, the posture, the authority earned through 2 decades of service. But he knew. He knew exactly who she was. Behind him, the funeral had already begun. Laverne could hear the soft hum of gospel music. Slow, reverent, hollow, she could see the silhouettes of Malcolm's cousins and siblings through the glass chapel doors. White roses curled around the altar. A folded flag lay atop the casket that should have waited for her to arrive. That casket held the body of Staff Sergeant Malcolm Jerome Cole, her husband of 21 years, and no one inside had thought she deserved to stand beside it. The usher didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply turned away, easing the lock into place with a glance over his shoulder, as if confirming with someone inside that the task was done. He didn't know how many battlefields Laverne had crossed. He didn't care how many nights she had slept in the dirt, how many times her body had shielded her husband's during his final months in hospice. In this moment, she was just an inconvenience. A black woman in a place where white grief ruled, Laverne stood still for 3 whole songs. She didn't knock again, didn't plead. Her boots remained rooted to the ground while the memorial unfolded inside without her. When they began reading Malcolm's obituary, she heard someone else's voice claiming moments she had lived. They called his death peaceful, surrounded by family, but they didn't say it was her hands that had rubbed balm into his swollen knees, her voice that had sung to him when morphine wasn't enough, her tears that had soaked his uniform before the nurses zipped the final bag. They had erased her. With one decision, Malcolm's estranged family, white, wealthy, and determined to control appearances, had written her out of his goodbye. A different kind of war had begun, and this one didn't use bullets. Laverne turned, got back in her car, and drove. She didn't cry on the way back. Her face stayed fixed. Her fingers gripped the wheel like she was guiding a convoy through enemy Ak territory. The gravel road out of Bayless, Mississippi was long and empty, lined with tall trees and silence. At the first gas station, she pulled over, stepped into the restroom, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her uniform was flawless, her posture unshaken. But her eyes, they were cracked glass, not broken, not weeping, just cracked. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small folded paper she'd kept for years, Malcolm's handwritten instructions for his funeral. In his unmistakable cursive, it read, "Wherever I'm buried, I want you there. If they try to keep you away, move me." The words weren't metaphor. He meant it, and now she would follow them. Laverne didn't drive home. She turned east toward Jackson. By dusk, she stood in front of the State Veterans Affairs Office, a building with faded flags and a cracked parking lot. Inside, she walked past the stairs of junior staff and made her way to the desk of the officer she once mentored. During his first enlistment, she placed the paper down, then a second folder, copies of his VA burial benefits, marriage certificate, medical documentation, and signed burial preferences. It wasn't a request, it was a reckoning. The man didn't speak. He took the papers and nodded. Before sunrise, Laverne was already back in Bayless, not at the funeral home, but on the land Malcolm had bought a decade ago. 25 acres of red earth and wild grass he had always said would be their peace when the noise ended. Laverne had never built the house they dreamed of. There had been too many deployments, too many surgeries, too much waiting. But now the land would serve another purpose. She cleared the old brush with her own hands. With each swing of the machete, she stripped away grief. With each drag of broken branches, she dug through betrayal. She wasn't making a garden. She was preparing a grave. Not one for Malcolm's body, yet, but one for the illusion that silence was safer than truth. The next day, a man in a navy blue pickup truck arrived. He was a fellow veteran, someone who had served with Malcolm in Kandahar. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, parked, and began helping. Then another came. Then 2 more. By the end of the week, there were 15 of them, each bringing their own tools and their own scars. They didn't talk much. They worked. Laverne named the land the People's Ground, and word spread. Across the South, black and brown veterans who had been left out of ceremonies, dismissed from burials, and overlooked by their spouses' families began writing to her. Some sent names of loved ones. Others asked to be buried there. A few just needed a place to mourn without asking permission. The state couldn't ignore her. The funeral home received a court summons. The Cole family received a cease and desist. And Laverne? She received peace. Not because she won anything yet, but because she had reclaimed the story. She wasn't the widow who waited outside. She was the soldier who built a new ground. When the news finally hit national TV, they didn't show the gate. They showed her hands digging the first grave. They showed her face, not full of rage, but of resilience. They showed the boots of veterans kneeling beside a black woman who had turned her rejection into a revolution. But the story had just begun. By the 3rd week, there was a flagpole on the land. It didn't come from any government office. One of the men had driven overnight from Oklahoma with it in the back of his rusted van, wrapped in a torn blanket beside his old medals and a folded note from his son. The pole stood exactly 12 feet high, its base surrounded by loose red stones, and Laverne chose the highest point of the land to plant it. The wind that afternoon cut sharp, but the stars and stripes rose anyway. It wasn't a tribute to a country that had denied her presence, but to the idea of duty, to the belief that service should still mean something, even when the uniform no longer protected you from shame. When she hoisted the flag up herself, she didn't make a speech. She didn't even glance at the cameras that had now begun to park daily across the rural road. They waited for her tears, but she gave none, because what she was building here wasn't for their sound bites or social media sympathy. It was for the forgotten ones, the men and women who were always first to be called for war and last to be honored in peace. Malcolm's name wasn't written on any marble yet, but she carried him in every brick they laid. A memorial wall began to form at the far end of the field, built from salvaged concrete, hand-painted wood, and rusted plaques that veterans mailed from around the country. One piece came from a Vietnamese immigrant who said he owed his life to a black Marine named Cole. Another sent a helmet from Desert Storm with a note taped to the inside reading, "If they won't remember us, we will remember each other." Laverne read every note. Then she buried them all, under the wall, like seeds. She called it the Silent Archive. On the day the judge's ruling came down, Laverne was digging irrigation trenches. She hadn't checked her phone in hours. The lawyer had promised to call the moment the court gave its answer. She hadn't expected much. The funeral home had deep pockets. The Cole family had connections. And Mississippi wasn't known for apologizing to women who looked like her. But the message came in a 3-word text. "You won." She didn't freeze, didn't celebrate. She stood, wiped sweat from her face, and kept digging. Because the court's ruling wasn't a gift. It was a correction. It declared that Malcolm's burial had violated his written will, that Laverne had been unlawfully excluded, that she held every legal right to exhume and rebury him wherever she chose, and she chose the land they had dreamed of. The funeral home issued a brief statement filled with bureaucratic regret. The Cole family lawyer called the media with claims of miscommunication. But the world had already turned its eyes to Laverne, and what they saw wasn't grief. It was architecture, not the kind of structures built with hammers, but with hands and memory. The reburial was set for Sunday. Not in a chapel, not in silence, but in community. Veterans came from 31 states. Some drove across deserts, others crossed rivers in borrowed buses. They brought ashes, uniforms, photos, stories. Some carried prosthetic limbs. Others wore sunglasses to hide decades of wounds. They came not just to honor Malcolm, but to honor her, the woman who hadn't just buried a man. She had uncovered a forgotten country within the country. At dawn, Laverne walked the field alone. She carried Malcolm's ashes in a cedar box she carved herself. No one helped her. She had insisted. She wore the same uniform she had the day she was denied entry to his funeral, but this time she was surrounded by men and women who stood when she passed. No orders, no rehearsals, just instinct. She placed the box under the old tamarind tree. Malcolm once said reminded him of his mother's garden. She dug the hole with her own shovel. When her arms trembled, she paused. When her knees buckled, she steadied herself on the soil. She didn't break. She didn't rush. She buried him slowly, deliberately, with dignity. And when she stood again, the entire field was silent. Then the music began. Not a hymn, not a trumpet, not anything official. A young boy began humming from the crowd, an old field song Laverne recognized from her grandmother's front porch. Others joined in. Veterans clapped. Some raised fists. A few just stood in silence, letting the air carry what words could not. By sunset, the people's ground had changed. It was no longer just soil and wood and flags. It was a story, and stories, when told right, can rewrite laws. A week later, the Department of Veterans Affairs announced a full investigation into private funeral homes receiving federal military burial funds while practicing discrimination. Laverne's case became Exhibit A. Lawmakers, once silent, began drafting a proposal named the Cole Act, focused on ensuring no veteran spouse would ever again be excluded based on race, gender, or background. Laverne didn't go to Washington. She stayed on the land, planting more trees, reading more letters, and building benches for families who had nowhere else to sit with their dead. Every Sunday, she read Malcolm's favorite poem aloud to whoever came. It wasn't about war. It wasn't even about death. It was about rivers, about how water always finds its way home, even through stone, just like her. The headlines faded, but her work didn't. A month after Malcolm's reburial, the world had already moved on to the next crisis. The journalists had packed their cameras. The hashtags had quieted. Politicians stopped calling. But Laverne still woke up at 5 a.m. every morning, tied her boots, and walked the boundaries of the people's ground like it was a post she had sworn to guard. There were no fences around the land. She never wanted any. No gates to keep people out was her quiet philosophy. She believed the land itself would choose who belonged, and somehow it did. Grieving mothers arrived without invitations. Homeless veterans camped quietly under trees, always cleaning up after themselves. Volunteers kept coming. Some stayed for a day, others for weeks. One man from New Jersey arrived to drop off his father's Bronze Star and left only after helping install the solar lights that now lined the paths. It wasn't just a place anymore, it was a language. People didn't need to explain their losses here. They just brought them. Folded in letters, locked in urns, printed on faded photos, or carried in their silence. And Laverne received each one with the same dignity she had once reserved for her husband's medals. But even with all this growth, the land still held shadows. One came in the form of a letter. Folded in thick parchment, stamped with the insignia of a federal agency, and addressed not to Sergeant Cole, but to Mrs. Laverne M. Cole, widow of Staff Sergeant Malcolm Cole. The formal language reeked of apology disguised as recognition. It stated that after reviewing her case and considering the events that transpired, she was being posthumously awarded an honor on Malcolm's behalf. The Distinguished Service, Family Medal, with her name etched underneath. They hadn't wanted to honor her. They had wanted to repair the headlines. She placed the medal in a drawer and never mentioned it. But something else came with the letter. Something she hadn't expected. Request for her to speak. Before Congress. Not to accept an award, but to testify as a key voice in upcoming legislation addressing veteran spouse discrimination, racial exclusion in funeral processes, and unregulated funeral home practices. The Cole Act, now moving through committees, had been shaped in part by her lawsuit. Her silence had become policy. Now they wanted her voice. She said yes, not for them, for the others, for the women who had stood at cemetery gates in silence, for the men turned away from their partners' burials because of old paperwork and closed minds, for the children who had never heard their parents' name spoken in a eulogy because someone erased it. She arrived in D.C. wearing the same uniform, not pressed for cameras, worn with the creases of labor and truth. In the hearing room, she sat, beneath fluorescent lights and behind a thin metal nameplate. Faces stared at her across polished desks, some curious, some indifferent, some uncomfortable. She could feel the weight of their expectations. They wanted tears. A few wanted outrage. What they got was precision. Laverne didn't read from notes. She spoke from scars. She told them what it meant to be erased at the very moment her husband was lowered into the earth. She described the cold click of the gate, the silence of the mourners, the way the country's gratitude stopped exactly where her skin began. She didn't ask for justice. She demanded alignment between the values carved on military walls and the actions taken when the uniform came off. When she finished, no one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment, but no one moved either, because some truths lock your spine in place. By the end of the month, the bill passed its first vote with bipartisan support. But Laverne was already back on the land. She didn't wait for laws to change. She just kept changing the land. That fall, she expanded the site again, this time building a reflection circle at the center of the property, made of stone benches surrounding a flat water basin filled with photographs laminated and preserved beneath clear glass. Each image belonged to someone lost, discarded, or buried improperly. The basin was shallow enough for light to touch the faces, but deep enough that the reflections danced on the surface when the wind passed. Veterans came just to sit there. Even children came, placing flowers for grandparents they'd never met. One boy brought his father's boots and asked if they could be buried under the largest tree. Laverne knelt, took the boots, and did just that. She started receiving hate mail around this time. Not much, just enough to remind her that change always has a cost. One anonymous letter accused her of turning a sacred military tradition into a race-based pity project. Another claimed her land was unlicensed and illegal. Someone even mailed her a copy of her wedding license with the word "invalid" scribbled across it in red ink. She kept every letter, then she burned them all one night, each one lit with a match, tossed into a steel barrel, turned to ash, while Malcolm's folded flag sat in her lap. She didn't need permission to keep going. She had already built more than any of them could destroy. One evening, as the sun fell behind the cypress trees, Laverne walked to the tamarind where Malcolm was buried. A young soldier had just been buried beside him that morning, a woman, 27 years old, who had died by suicide. Her mother had no money for a funeral. The VA had delayed paperwork, but Laverne had opened the ground for her. Now they lay beside each other, the living and the fallen, side by side. Laverne sat between the two graves, her hands resting on the soil, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to weep. Not out of grief, but out of recognition. Because this was what legacy looked like. Not a speech, not a title, but a place. A place where those denied by the system were accepted by the land. She didn't wipe her tears, she let them fall into the ground, where even silence was honored. The morning sky over the people's ground was the softest it had ever been. Pale blue, almost white near the horizon, like the land itself was holding its breath. The trees, now taller than when she had first broken the soil, leaned gently in the wind, as if nodding toward the woman walking their perimeter in her uniform. It was a Sunday, 1 year to the day since they shut her out of Malcolm's funeral. 1 year since the gate had clicked shut in her face like a steel punctuation mark on 21 years of marriage. 1 year since her grief was publicly erased, since her husband's family tried to bury him without her name attached to his memory. 1 year since the nation learned that sometimes you can serve a country and still be invisible at its final rites. But today, something different was happening. Car after car lined the dirt road. They came from out of state, out of town, even from out of the country. There were buses parked along the far fence where there used to be nothing but weeds. Rows of folding chairs had been set up in the clearing between the tamarind and the newly finished reflection pool. And at the center of it all, under a modest canvas tent, stood a covered plaque waiting to be unveiled. Laverne didn't ask for the ceremony. In truth, she'd tried to avoid it, but the governor had called. So had 2 senators. The Veterans Affairs Secretary had written her a handwritten note. The bill named after Malcolm, the Cole Act, had just passed into law with overwhelming support, and they all insisted the first memorial dedication under the new legislation take place here, on the land where it was born, on the ground that a forgotten widow had turned into sacred space. Laverne wore her uniform once more, though the medals had changed. She had added only one, the Civil Service Medal awarded not by the military, but by a grassroots coalition of veteran families who credited her with waking the system up. It had no value in government circles, but to her it meant everything. As guests filed in, the hum of quiet voices gave the place a kind of reverent vibration. No music played, no speeches had begun, but people were already weeping, not because they were sad, but because something about the land, the trees, the graves, the stories rising from the soil, made their own losses feel seen, validated, no longer dismissed. Near the reflection basin, 2 young women knelt beside photographs embedded in glass. One whispered her brother's name. Another left a bracelet, made of military tags. An elderly Navajo man in full veteran regalia traced his fingers over the stone path. A group of teenage cadets stood in a perfect line, holding flags they'd brought from their high school program in Atlanta. No one had told them to come. They just had to. Then came the ceremony. No stage, just a single podium placed between 2 trees. The governor's speech was brief and respectful. The senators read from prepared notes. They praised Laverne's courage, the precedent set by her court case, and the symbolism of the land. But the moment that silenced the crowd wasn't a speech. It was when Laverne herself walked forward to unveil the plaque. She didn't say anything. She simply reached up, took hold of the cloth, and pulled it away. The plaque was made of dark bronze, mounted on a smooth black stone. It read, "The People's, ground in memory of Staff Sergeant Malcolm Cole, and in honor of all those denied their rightful place beside the ones they served, loved, and buried. This land stands for those who were forgotten, until one woman refused to let them remain invisible. Founded by Sergeant Laverne M. Cole. Let the ground remember what the world tried to forget." A hush fell so heavy you could hear the wind threading through branches. Then, one by one, people stood and saluted, not because it was commanded, but because it was earned. Laverne stepped back from the plaque and looked out at the rows of faces. Some broken, some proud, some quietly trembling. She didn't need to speak. The land was already doing it for her. Every corner of it, every tree, every path, every bench was built on what was stolen from her that day at the church, and she had taken that theft and turned it into permanence. Later that evening, after the crowd had gone, after the cameras were packed, after the flags were gently folded and the folding chairs collapsed and stored, Laverne remained behind. She walked the field alone, past the tamarind, past the rows of new markers, past the mural painted across the community container, and there, in the circle of quiet trees, she sat with her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. No medals clinked, no titles mattered. She wasn't a widow. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't even the founder. She was simply Malcolm's wife. The woman who had stood at a locked gate and decided never again. Not for her. Not for anyone. The moon rose, pale and honest above the trees. The lights, powered by solar panels, lit up the path behind her. In the far distance, a child's voice carried through the air, reading aloud from a laminated letter beside a grave. The child didn't know Laverne, was listening. Didn't know that this land existed because someone refused to sit quietly in pain. The child only knew that this was a place where you could speak, and the earth would answer with memory. And in that moment, Laverne smiled, not because she had won, but because she had rebuilt something that could not be torn down, a place where no gate would ever close again,